This is the Ecofiscal Commission's first Google Hangout, so it's new technology for us, so I hope this is all going to work. My name is Chris Ragan. I am chair of Canada's Ecofiscal Commission, and we are delighted to have a group of interesting and knowledgeable experts with us today as we talk about everybody's favorite topic, which is traffic jams and how to get out of them. So let me just very quickly tell you who we have on the Google Hangout. We have Gridlock Sam Schwartz, who is going to tell us how he got that nickname. He's an engineer, he's a former New York City traffic commissioner, and the architect of the Move New York plan, which we'll learn about over the next few minutes. We have Gunnar Soderholm is joining us from Stockholm, where he's the head of the Environment and Health Administration. He's the former CEO of the City of Stockholm and was responsible for that city's congestion charge project. Lauren Mattern is a city planner in Los Angeles, and she spent the past 5 years helping to build and evaluate an award-winning new parking program, that's parking program, in San Francisco, and she's going to tell us why parking is interestingly related to traffic congestion. That's a cool story. David Levinson is a professor of civil, environmental, and geoengineering at the University of Minnesota. He's a transportation engineer, planner, and expert. He focuses on that all-important intersection between our transportation infrastructure and our travel choices and travel behavior. And Eric Jaffe is New York bureau chief of the Atlantic's CityLab, and he's probably one of the world's leading journalists covering international transportation and traffic solutions. So thank you all very much for being here. I am really looking forward to this conversation. Now this morning, the Ecofiscal Commission released a brand new report. Here it is. Okay, we can all see that. There we go. And it's called "We Can't Get There From Here and Why Pricing Congestion is Critical to Beating It." So there's the report, and you can find that right now on our website, which is www.ecofiscal.ca. Now the primary argument in the report is this: that traffic congestion is extremely costly. In fact, it's even worse than how it feels behind the wheel. It hurts our health, it hurts our wallets, it reduces the quality of our lives, and in growing cities, it is just getting worse. That's true across the world, and it's certainly true in Canadian cities. And solving congestion requires two things. People do need more choices in terms of how they get around, but they also need better incentives about how to use the existing capacity that we've got. Now, cities across Canada have been working very hard on the first thing. We've been doing more investments in public transit, better roads, new and better bridges, but we've been ignoring the second part, that part about incentives. The fact is, we will not reduce congestion without getting those incentives right, and that is the missing piece of the policy puzzle, and that is where congestion pricing comes in. Now, the idea of pricing congestion is relatively new in Canada, but it's an idea that cities around the world have tried and have adopted with a lot of success. So there's a lot that we can learn from those experiences, and that's exactly why we're here today to talk to these experts from around the world. So before we dive in, just a quick reminder that you can follow the discussion on Twitter and send in questions for our panelists using hashtag #BeatTraffic. That's hashtag #BeatTraffic. Or you can email your questions to media@ecofiscal.ca. That's media@ecofiscal.ca, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Now to start, the idea of pricing congestion is a little bit abstract for some people, and it can look like different things. So let's get into some real-life examples. So I'm going to start with Gunnar. Gunnar, Stockholm is probably one of the world's most well-known case studies of congestion pricing. Can you tell us in a couple of minutes what Stockholm's program looks like and how it's working?
Well, the Stockholm program was due to an estimated cost of between 3 and 8 billion Swedish crowns, which is about 500 to $1 billion US dollar a year. And it was introduced in 3rd of January 2006. It was a huge resistance from the citizens of Stockholm. About 80–85% were against the idea, but once it was in place, people changed their mind. We charged the motorists between 6:30 in the morning and 6:30 in the afternoon, and what we charge people is from the inner city. I don't know if you can see this map, but from 18 control points, we control all traffic in and out from the inner city, and that gives us a chance to regulate the traffic. We have a reduction of about 25%, between 20 and 25% compared to the situation 2000. We charge the motorists between $1.50 and $3, depending on if you are driving in the peak hour. It's a little bit more expensive. It's about it's a maximum fee of $8 a day. It's the same price for trucks and for private cars. Very few exemptions nowadays, but the traffic effects has actually remained since the introduction in 2006, despite the fact that we haven't raised the price, and we are now 100,000 people, more people in the city, 200,000 more people in the region, and still no increase of traffic. So we and the 1st of January 2016, in 2 months, we will raise the price by about 75%. And today, it's no protest at all. We had a trial for 7 months from January to July 2006, then we had a referendum in September 2006, and people voted for a continuation, small majority, 53 to 47, but it was in place, and today the latest opinion poll shows that we have 70% in favor of the congestion tax and very few against it. We have a lot of winners, very few losers, and when we now announce that we will raise the price by 75%, the maximum fee, maximum charge for a day from 60 Swedish crowns to 105 Swedish crowns. There is no protest at all, and it's very interesting. And at that time, it divided the city council into a left-wing bloc and into a right-wing. Today we have, and since many years now, we have a full political consensus about the congestion taxes.
Gunnar, Gunnar,
okay.
So I'd like just a quick follow-up, because one of the things that I think is fascinating about the Stockholm case is exactly what you've talked about, with the public support being pretty much absent before the policy, but now massively in favor. So can you just speak very briefly to that point? Is this just the demonstration effect of successful policy?
I think the system itself changed the opinion. People liked what they saw. It was a totally different city. I tried to show you another slide here. I don't know if it's right, but this picture is from the day before. This is the day after. We have free flow in all streets all the day. No one had seen anything like it since we had horses in the streets in Stockholm, and that was amazing. And even the traffic experts were astonished about the traffic effects. So we really there was a lot of sunshine stories. We cut down the traveling times between 30 and 50%. The bus traffic had a much better flow. The bus passenger, they saved between 15 and 20 minutes in a single ride, and people understood that it was not the end of the world. They could afford the congestion charges.
That's wonderful. So thank you, Gunnar. So one of the questions that we might come back to today, later on, is whether there's any reason to think that people in Stockholm are different than people in Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary. So you can think about that, but I'm going to move on now. Thank you very much, Gunnar, to David. David is in Minnesota, where he teaches and works. Now, they've got a very different system. So, David, can you tell us what congestion looked like in Minneapolis and how the system is designed and how that has worked out?
So, in Minneapolis, we installed a hot lane in 2004 on I-394, which is a freeway that goes from downtown Minneapolis to the western suburbs. And previously it had been HOV lanes, so high occupancy vehicles had been allowed to use the road, and the HOV lanes were underutilized. That is, there was a significant amount of capacity on the road that wasn't being used, so it looked like the lanes were empty. Now, they were moving a significant number of people. They were moving buses and people in carpools, but there was more capacity to be had. So the idea was to sell off the excess capacity, and that's a high occupancy toll lane. And so anyone who is a single occupant vehicle who wants to use the lane pays a toll, and the toll varies dynamically. So it ranges from 25 cents when there's not much congestion to $8 when there's a lot of congestion. The system was expanded in 2010 or so down I-35W, which goes from downtown Minneapolis to the southern suburbs, and a third facility from downtown St. Paul to St. Paul's northern suburbs is currently under construction. The idea is that people who are in a hurry can pay to get out of congestion because the tolls guarantee that the hot lanes themselves won't be congested. The parallel untolled lanes, of course, will still suffer some congestion, but even the users of those lanes are benefited because some people will move out of those lanes into the hot lanes.
Right. That's great. Thank you, David. When I talk about hot lanes and tolled routes in this country, many people respond by asking about whether we have the technology to do it. So can you just comment quickly on, what are the technological needs? Is technology an obstacle to doing hot lanes in Minneapolis, or is this all easy peasy now?
Well, it's not free, but it's well within our technical capacity to do this. We've done this in a number of places. I'm going to try to share my screen and go to a slide, and the slide's going to show.
That's pretty high tech. Pretty high tech.
No, it's risky.
You can do it. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Come on. Whoa. Okay, hold on there. Cumulative mileage.
Okay, so this is the cumulative mileage of hot lanes in the United States, and all of these, which started in 1995 with SR91 in California and have grown significantly over time, have used electronic toll collection. And the idea behind electronic toll collection is that you have a transponder in your vehicle, and when you pass under a gantry, which basically is reading your transponder and knows that you are there, your account is dinged and some money is withdrawn from an account that you've set up in advance. If you don't have a transponder in your vehicle, you're generally not allowed to use the lanes, although there are some systems which will then take a photograph of your license plate and send you a bill. I believe in Toronto that's done on the One Toll facility in Toronto. Nice. And that type of automated vehicle identification is another technology. And this has been around since the early 1990s, so we're 20 years into this technology, and it's fairly standard.
So David, I'm looking at that graph, and the geeky economist in me sees that is a monotonically increasing function, which means, does it mean that no tollway was reversed?
None of the hot lanes have been reversed. I'll say so far, but but to date, none of these toll lanes have been reversed. Most of them have been converted from HOV lanes, but some of them are new construction now. None of them in any significant way are conversions of general purpose lanes. That is, none of them are converting untolled lanes to hot lanes.
So on the point of public acceptability then, I mean, all of these worked in the sense that they reduced congestion, but they also, apparently, they didn't generate a lot of public opposition. Right.
I mean, there's always public opposition. There's some criticism of the lanes, and that the people who have more money will be more likely to use the lanes than people who have less money, and that's, of course, true. I mean, that's the point of having money. But the people who have less money still use the lanes sometimes because they are also in a hurry. And in terms of public acceptance, the acceptance among low-income groups, medium-income groups, and high-income groups is all favorable and fairly similar after they're installed. And there's always a little bit of skepticism before they've ever been installed in an area because people are unfamiliar and people dislike new things. But once they see it in operation, there's a comfort level with it. People, are in a hurry. If you're poor and you have a job and you're late for your job and you need to get there or risk being fired, it's very important that you might take the lane sometimes in order to be on time.
Right.
If you have a child who's in daycare and there's a penalty for picking up your child late at the daycare, the penalty might be greater than the toll, so it's worth paying the toll in order to save the $15 penalty for being late. So there's a number of scenarios that people will use these for, and then some people just like it because it's reliable and you can guarantee your travel time as opposed to the general purpose lanes where the travel times are highly variable.
And sometimes the penalty for missing your child is just an angry child, which is rather important too.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you, David. That's excellent. Let's move to San Francisco, where Lauren probably has the best weather of any of us today. So, is it not nice weather today?
Raining for once.
Oh, for once. Yeah. Okay. You're not getting any sympathy from us. So, Lauren, why don't you tell us what's going on in San Francisco in terms of their parking pricing project and how that relates to traffic congestion?
Mm-hmm. Right. So about 3 or 4 years ago, San Francisco launched a federally funded sort of test of parking as a congestion management tool. It was actually funds that were freed up from some other cities that were also trying to make some progress on congestion pricing. There had been quite a bit of academic discussion about whether or not parking could be used as a congestion management tool and how effective it would be. So the SF Park project here in San Francisco was sort of a first attempt to really test that on the ground in the messy streets of a real city. We set it up as a very robust, pretty technology-heavy approach to parking management. We used parking sensors, new meters, pretty sophisticated data management system. And the basis of it was that we would try to get the right price for both public on and off street parking that the city controls, and see if we could reduce the circling part of traffic congestion in that way. So parking on street parking and off street parking in cities, it's a little bit different, I think, in every city, but some similarities. Here in San Francisco, we have the pretty typical scenario of lots of circling in our downtown areas, in our commercial corridors. You could really feel that congestion. We have a pretty heavy surface transit fleet, and a lot of buses, personal vehicles, and delivery vehicles are often stuck behind traffic congestion. People circling, double parked vehicles is a big issue in San Francisco.
Right.
So it was a good place to try this notion out, and the approach is to see if we can get the pricing right. If we could free up 1 or 2 open parking spaces per block by slowly arriving at the right price, we wouldn't have to see as much circling and double parking.
And Lauren, did the prices adjust by time of day or by availability of parking spots?
Yes, we slowly, incrementally adjusted parking rates based on time of day and day of week. And this was all using some new exciting data that we had from installing parking sensors in every block in every parking space in our pilot area. So we were able to finally get some real information about how those spaces were being used, which was a bit of a question mark before that. We know that there's a parking problem, but it's hard to diagnose and move forward from that problem.
So do you know, before the actual policy was put in place, do you know how much of the congestion in that downtown core was caused by people circling and looking for parking spots?
Yeah, that's a tough question that I think a lot of academics and practitioners all struggle with answering. The literature suggests, you hear the 30% number quite a bit. I think it varies a lot based on exactly the block and part of city. So I can't give you an exact number. I don't think the research is solid.
But how about public support after? How about public support after the policy was put in place?
Yeah. Changing parking rates, like many of the projects we're talking about today, is really tough to tackle and have a good public conversation about. What we did is we paired our policy changes, our pricing changes, with really a dramatically improved user experience. We tried to really hone in on exactly how charging variable rates for parking was going to improve everyone's experience, including drivers. that I think was absolutely essential to explaining the benefits and getting broader buy-in. And yeah, the program is overall quite successful and popular.
Great. Okay, thank you, Lauren. Okay, so let's move to the other end of your country, to New York. Now, Sam, New York does not currently have a program in place, but it does have a major proposal on the table that is being considered. This is the Move New York plan. So you are the brains behind this plan. So can you tell us what's been proposed and why, and where the name gridlock comes in?
Sure. Congestion pricing was conceived here in New York by William Vickery. So I'm really jealous of Stockholm. I'm jealous of London and other cities that have done it. New York City has tried in 1971. I worked for John Lindsay, who was mayor at the time, and we tried to introduce congestion pricing. It failed then. Later on, I worked for Ed Koch. It failed under him. Bloomberg tried in 2007, 2008. Lauren referred to that money that San Francisco got. Again, I'm jealous because she got a lot of the money from New York City when our state would not vote for it. So the Move New York plan is based on what we've learned over those 45 years. What I've learned, I've spent a lot of time with the opponents to the previous plans, especially the Bloomberg plan, the more recent plan. And what I found with the opponents is, if I had to put it in a single word, is they felt the plan was unfair. So the Move New York plan is often referred to as the fair plan. What it does is it lowers the tolls in all the outer areas of New York City. So we have tolls in places between Queens and the Bronx. We have tolls in the Rockaways, which go nowhere near the central business district. So we set some rules, and the rules were only if you have good transit would we impose tolls in areas where you had a lot of congestion and good transit. So we've lowered the tolls everywhere else by as much as $5 round trip, which equates to about 35 to 45% round trip. So that's one element of the fairness, that we only apply the tolls where you have the congestion. Another element of the fairness is that people felt that especially in the outer boroughs of New York City and the suburbs, that Manhattanites, the people that live in Manhattan, are among the wealthiest in New York City, which is true, and that they were getting much of the benefit, if not all the benefit, and a lot of that was true, and that they would never be contributing to this congestion fund. That too was true, because the average Manhattanite doesn't travel across any of the crossings that would be tolled under the plan. So we changed the plan so there's a congestion charge for when people are using taxis, black cars, Ubers within the central business district. And the third leg of the fairness is that drivers were being asked to contribute, and they felt they weren't getting anything in return. So we, under the Bloomberg plan, the Lindsay plan, or the Koch plan, all the money went to transit. In this case, 1/4 of the money goes for roads and bridges, and that brought in the people that had sued me when I worked for Ed Koch, the Automobile Club of New York, also called the AAA, the Trucking Association of New York. They're all supporters of the plan now. So we now have the basics of the plan, and we're going through the legislative process. As for the word gridlock, 1980 there was a transit strike in New York City. All the subways, all the buses went out for 11 days. I came up with a plan called the gridlock. It was hyphenated prevention plan, and within days the word caught on like wildfire. Dictionaries, encyclopedia editors were contacting me, William Safire on language in the New York Times, and the word has taken off since then. And in New York, I'm known as Gridlock Sam.
Well, I love that. Thank you very much. So I want to come back to, there's a small comment right at the beginning. You said that it was created originally, or conceived originally, by William Vickery. So for those people who don't know, he's an economist who won a Nobel Prize about, I'm guessing, about 15 years ago, and he died in a car in traffic a week later after being named as the Nobel laureate. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that is correct, and I was hoping to celebrate with him because he kept petitioning me after all those years to try to introduce congestion pricing. I tried, but politically failed.
Okay, so the plan that you've talked about is, I mean, it addresses head-on the fairness issue. It also addresses head-on the recycling of the revenues issue going into public transit. So I mean, do we now have a plan in place though that looks like it is acceptably fair to most of the voices, or is there still huge opposition, or?
Right now we're now in a plurality of public support for the plan. It looks like we'll soon be, once the plan is explained, it's in the majority. However, and last week the Progressive Caucus of the City Council came out in support of the plan. We have a mayor and a governor who have stated that they're car guys, and we don't yet have their support, and that's going to be critical. And that's where we're spending our energy, trying to line up the political support for the plan to get the mayor to endorse it and the governor.
But it's interesting. You said that some of these opponents have identified themselves as car guys, and therefore they're opposed. But I would think that it's exactly the car guys whose lives we're trying to improve by reducing traffic congestion and improving travel times and getting people to where they want to go faster.
Yeah, it's a very logical argument, but sometimes the logical arguments don't win. And the Borough of Queens, we have the most opposition from the Borough of Queens, and they're suffering the most because they have, first of all, they benefit. 5 of their bridges will go down in price. 1 bridge will be tolled, and that 1 bridge is sandwiched between 2 toll crossings. So we have something very unique in New York City, and that is shopping for the cheapest bridge or the cheapest route, and that causes a lot of congestion.
Okay, we'll come back to that. So thank you, Sam. That's great. Now, just for anybody who's just come in, we're hanging out here in a Google Hangout with transportation experts talking about how cities around the world beat traffic congestion. So you can tweet your questions to our experts using hashtag #BeatTraffic, or by email you can send us questions at media@ecofiscal.ca. So now I want to get to Eric. So Eric, you've been following the stories of cities like Stockholm and Minneapolis and San Francisco and New York and Milan and Singapore and London, England for years, and you've shed a lot of light on how pricing is part of a broader movement to get our modern cities moving. Now we find here in Canada, and maybe it's also true in the United States, that it hasn't really become part of the mainstream conversation. The mainstream conversation is about traffic congestion and how horrible it is, and it's often about, you know, why we just need more roads, more bridges, and more public transit, but not very many people are talking about traffic congestion. So given that these examples exist around the world and that they are working, like, how do we get people to look at those and to consider them and to consider that what works in those other cities might actually work here? Eric?
Yeah, Chris, it's a great question, and as you think about it, first of all, you're right. It hasn't really taken off across the world. I mean, we've got the notable examples of London, Singapore, and of course Stockholm. But otherwise, a lot of cities like New York that you would think would want a program like this haven't had one, haven't been able to materialize the support for it. And so when you think about why that is, I mean, I see 3 reasons. The first is that it's just very hard to get over the idea that congestion pricing is a tax. And when we were just talking about William Vickery, after his Nobel Prize was awarded, he had a quote that I'll read here that was put out in a press release. It said, quote, "People see it," meaning congestion pricing, "people see it as a tax increase, which I think is a gut reaction. When motorists' time is considered, it's really a savings." And so you have this battle of getting people to perceive congestion pricing as really a good, or at least a service that they're purchasing, as opposed to a tax. Because when you frame it as a tax, you bring with it all the problems of taxation. There's a reason that America hasn't raised its gas tax in 20-some years, and that's because people don't like taxes. There's an entire party that will refuse to even have the discussion. So that's the first and probably the biggest barrier. The second is something that's been pointed out in the literature by Mike Manville at Cornell and David King at Columbia, and it's called credible commitment. And it's just the idea, basically, that people don't trust their transit authority to use the money properly and equitably, even if the plan says that that's what it'll do. They get on they see their subway, they see their bus system, they take a late ride one time, they get delayed, and they don't have faith in the agency that's operating everything. And when Manville and King interviewed several dozen officials in Los Angeles several years back, they had a full third of them saying, sure, I mean, we understand this plan and that it could benefit us, but we don't trust the people who are in charge of handling the money to redistribute it properly. So we're not going to support it, even if logically, as Sam was pointing out before, it makes sense.
Right.
And then the third barrier is just this idea of familiarity. You were talking with Gunnar about the demonstration effect, and it's kind of this difficult cycle in which, because you don't have any pilot projects testing out congestion pricing, you don't get support for congestion pricing, because the one thing we do know, as Gunnar also pointed out, is that whenever people see this program in action, they completely change their minds about it, and they love it. And this doesn't, I mean, this can be seen in a couple ways. I mean, there was a public education forum a couple years back in Washington, D.C. to try to understand why people didn't support congestion pricing the way people in a crowded metro like Washington, D.C. probably should. And before the forum began, there was 39% support for these types of congestion programs. After a day of public information and seminars and discussions with the types of folks here today, that rose 10%. And that's just that was just kind of education. That wasn't actually seeing on the ground how amazingly these programs can make a difference in everyday lives. So I think you see those three main barriers as the primary ones when it comes to public support.
Excellent, because I wanted to come back to when people view this as a tax. Of course, nobody likes a tax, but here it looks like a tax, and you get nothing back because you actually don't believe it will work. And that's over and over again. People just tell me, this is crazy, this won't work, this won't change anything. Yet, in fact, when you put these policies in place, they work. So somebody is changing their behavior. So that's great. Thank you, Eric. Okay. Let me now turn to some questions that we've received from the people out there. So I'm going to just read some questions, and then I'm going to ask a couple of people in each case to give us a quick response. So the first one is about public acceptance of pricing. So Zvi Lev wants to know how we can make it more politically palatable. So you've just heard Eric talk about 3 obstacles that are really about public perception. So Zvi has asked, how do we make it more politically palatable? Gideon Foreman asks, he asks if we should use a different name. Maybe we should call it decongestion pricing. Or, maybe we can come up with some better name. So how about Sam and Eric on that? Sam, you want to start off?
Sure, and dealing with Gideon's, I started out with my plan decongesting New York, and I got some input from some of the cold medicine companies that thought I was competing with them. But yes, I'm now changing the vernacular from tolling to electronic charging. And I do that because every time you mention the word toll, it conjures up toll booths. And people see slowdowns, no matter how many times I've explained that there wouldn't be a single toll booth. So it's electronic charging. I've toyed with a number of things. We've tried value pricing and others. If somebody can come up with something more palatable, wonderful. In terms of the politics, I think Eric was right on. We've been finding exactly the points that he made. and how you explain to people their own benefits, that it's in their interest. The very interesting thing that we find with congestion charging or electronic charging is that we do have support on the right and we do have support on the left. On the right, it's a user fee. And if we explain it that way, that people are paying and getting something in return, and the more hot lanes that we see out there, people will have some concept of what it's like. And on the left is the social justice aspect of it. The revenue, much of the revenue goes into transit, which is lower income people. So if somebody has that magic bullet to explain it, we want to hear it.
Okay, Eric, what's your favorite way to package the policy to develop public acceptance?
It's a good question, Chris, in terms of talking about if we should replace the term. This is actually a poll that we at CityLab, we held this poll a couple years ago, and I know David Levinson contributed a name. We just wanted to get ideas for what a better name would be. And we had all kinds, from very hyper-technical names like variable road pricing and road demand mitigation, to names with alliteration like the smooth sailing zone, someone wrote in, and the free flow fee, somebody else wrote in. And when it came down to it, the best ideas were terms like David's idea of a road fee, or there was another idea of calling it a road fare, because you would create that parallel between mass transit and what's happening on the roads. But it's just kind of hard for these terms to sink in and really take hold. Once there's already something out there, as we know from global warming, it's hard to go from that to climate change. It can be done, but it takes time, and it takes a real concerted effort by people who are interested in making that transition.
How about the family togetherness policy or something like that? You don't want to be too Orwellian, I suppose, but you know, it is about getting home faster. I don't want to charge you to get home faster. I want to charge you so that you can get home faster.
Right. Whatever term will kind of express the benefits as opposed to the penalty of a tax, I think could help the situation.
Okay, second question. We received a number of questions about how to make pricing work for suburban communities. So Nadia in Toronto asks, how do we encourage shared mobility, not just in the downtown cores, but in the suburban areas as well? And related to that, Julie in Montreal asks, are we making assumptions that people will use alternatives to driving in response to congestion pricing? And what happens if those alternatives don't exist? So two questions there, one about how to make this work in suburban areas, one about alternatives. How about David and Gunnar? David, you want to start with that one?
Sure.
You pick which question you want to do.
Yeah, I'll pick looking at alternatives, and it depends on the system that you're talking about. So there's a lot of different systems that have been mentioned here. So you have the Stockholm system, or what Sam is proposing for New York, and that's effectively a cordon, and if you want to go into the central city area, then you have to pay a toll, and in New York, in many cases, you're paying a toll already. Some of them are things like hot lanes, and that's completely opt-in. You have the alternative of not paying to use the facility and then not using the facility and driving on the untolled roads. It will just take you longer, as it does today. So a lot of it depends on what the alternative is. The revenues for these systems can go to various things. Often they are directed, at least in part, towards transit services, so they're about providing an alternative. Now, if it's in a suburban community like a hot lane, the transit alternative is you drive to a park and ride lot and then you take an express bus into the central city or something like that. It is always harder to provide alternative services in low-density suburbs than it is in central cities, and that's just the nature of and the physics of the world. When people are closer together, it's easier to provide shared services for them than when they're spread far apart. And so you're already paying for roads if in the United States with a gas tax and with motor vehicle sales tax. Those don't cover the full costs of roads, but those cover a significant chunk of the operating costs. A lot of what's being talked about with road pricing is to move more of the cost into a more direct way. So instead of paying a gas tax when you fill up the tank, you'd pay a per mile charge as you're driving along. And the advantages of this are that it makes the price more salient. Of course, the disadvantage is it makes it more expensive to travel for people who are making those trips. But those are costs that are being borne by somebody already. And so the idea here is that it's making the people who are actually generating those costs pay more directly for them.
Right.
So I mean, there's no good answer to, well, it's going to cost me now more to travel. What can you do for me if you live in a low-density area and you still want to rely on a car to get where you're going? Maybe you'll telecommute. Maybe you'll make shorter trips and you'll go somewhere else. And maybe you'll just pay. And so there's a lot of different kinds of substitutions that people will make, but sometimes you have to suck it up and pay.
Right. So let me comment on the suburban versus downtown core, because we quite often hear this distinction. I'm going to come to you with this, Gunnar. That I actually got this question this morning in Montreal in an interview. But it seems to me that very often we've got limited access freeways that are going from the downtown core to the suburbs. That's exactly how people travel in by the suburbs. So it seems to me that if you had limited access freeways, that would be an ideal place to put on a hot lane, for example. And that's actually going to improve the lives of people in the suburbs, because many of them are driving into town, into the downtown core. So, Gunnar, is that a reasonable answer to the downtown core versus suburban areas question?
Well, perhaps, but in the Stockholm's case, I don't know, hot lanes, it's not what we use in Sweden or in the Stockholm area as well. The neighbor municipalities, the suburban areas of Stockholm, they were furious about it, but they actually changed their mind during the trial we had for congestion taxes. Not all the way, but from about 80% against to 55% against. And now we know that we have public support in all neighbor municipalities for the congestion taxes. And I think the reasons are three. We cut down the traveling times if they were driving from the suburb into the city center and vice versa. Right. And the second thing was, we also, the congestion, the inbound congestion, or the also created a lot of congestion for people who didn't have a goal point in the inner city or inside the cordon. And we cut down their traveling times, and they never spend a single Swedish crown in congestion tax. And the third thing I think is that of the reduction of 20 to 25% in Stockholm during the trial, 22%. Half of them went to public transit, and we have a quite very well extended public transit system with metro, commuter trains, and bus lines. And but the other half is disappearing traffic. It was more rational car driving, and so even if you don't have the alternative, it's of course it's much more difficult to motivate people to say we will put a price and there is nowhere to go. But still, people think more about when they're driving, and that could help. But of course, it's depending on the price. How are you using the money? You can have a long-term perspective. Now, the increase we have, we spend all the money on new metro lines in Stockholm. We have a huge package of infrastructure development in Stockholm, because we simply don't have the road space anymore, and everyone understands that.
Thank you, Gunnar. So, I mean, one of the things that interests me when I speak to people about this who are often opposed is that they simply believe that it won't work, and they tend to believe that they don't have alternatives. And one of the things that I think we learn about this is that people have more alternatives than they think. They think about driving slightly earlier or later, or carpooling, or paying $2 and getting there faster. And so there seems to be more flexibility in many of our schedules than we often think. Now, Lauren, I'm coming to you. Thank you, Gunnar, for that. Lauren, I'm coming to you now with a question from David. David observes that on New Year's Eve, when public transit is often free, I guess depending on which city you're talking about, the trains and buses are packed. So the question is, should free public transit be considered as a way to reduce traffic congestion? Lauren, that's for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think one that a lot of transit systems work through all the time. Here in San Francisco, there is a trend toward giving more and more groups free transit passes. And it just, I think at the end of the day, comes down to the operability of the system. If you can, free transit comes with a huge number of benefits, but if you can't operate a reliable system in the long term, you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot. So that conversation is tough, and I think it's important to try to bring both those to light.
But isn't it also the case, Lauren, that I mean, if we're talking about pricing a scarce resource, and that's really what congestion pricing is doing, that public transit is also a scarce resource, and so getting the prices right is unlikely to involve a zero price on public transit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're such different goods. It's hard to talk about them the same. The mission of public transit is a little bit, it has more weight to it than parking, and the time saved by the price you're going to pay for parking is a little bit more palpable. So I think we talk about parking charges in San Francisco in terms of we're going to charge the lowest price possible that achieves our goal for the system.
Right.
And that sort of tying the cost to the benefit has been helpful for us.
Well, so let me actually ask everybody, is there an example out there of a city that has introduced congestion pricing, and as a way to, let's say, ease the transition, they have lowered public transit fees to kind of to accentuate, to increase awareness of alternatives? Have we seen that in some city? Anybody?
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
In Sweden, Gothenburg introduced congestion taxes, which is the second biggest city in Sweden, and they don't have metro lines, for example. They have old tram lines, but it's very slow. Take the tram line if you have the time. Other cases you walk, but and they had introduced it, and the result was okay, but for different reasons, the public in Gothenburg voted for not for a continuation of the congestion tax, but it's still there because it financed a huge infrastructure package on the west coast of Sweden.
Okay, I've got a question now. I'm going to come back to Eric and Sam. This is a question from Jeremy, who's an engineering student. I don't know actually where he is studying, but he wants to know how congestion pricing could help make the freight industry a little bit greener. And by green, I think he does not mean more profitable, just a hunch. So does anybody have a thought on how to make whether this would make the freight industry a little bit more environmentally friendly? So Eric or Sam?
I suppose if you raise the price of what a truck is going to need to deliver goods into the city, if you raise that price, you might see some distributors switch to a rail system for their merchandise, or you might see within the city, I know some European cities have moved toward a system of actually making deliveries via bike as opposed to having trucks still drive around in the center of the city. So, I mean, the theme here being that when you make driving more expensive, you get less driving, holds to passenger vehicles, private vehicles, and also to freight vehicles. But I mean, what you're going to have then is potentially a higher cost of goods.
Right. Well, actually, on that point, I'm just wondering whether the cost of goods and all-in delivery charges are actually going to go down, because the trucks are spending a lot less time moving across the country. Sam, do you have a view on that?
Yes, well our plan took trucks and the cost of trucks operating into account, and that's why we lowered the tolls in a lot of places where we do have trucking on the Throgs Neck Bridge or the Verrazano Bridge, and we also eliminate trucks going through the central business district for free, which many trucks can now do on their way to New Jersey. But none of those things really lead towards what Jeremy's getting at, getting a little more green. But I did attend a conference just last week on intelligent transportation systems, and there was a company, I believe it was called Transpo, and they had a program called Transfix, and it's kind of like Uber for trucks, and they matched up trucks with origins, destinations that were closer to where they were, and as a result, truck vehicle miles traveled, VMT, went down dramatically. So there is a way of making them greener by reducing their VMT, which is part of what congestion pricing is about.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah, well, in the Stockholm case, we had, when we started, we had an exemption for clean cars, clean private cars, and for biogas cars, ethanol cars, and hybrids. And that was the strongest driver for people to buy an alternative fuel car. And it was so successful that the national government was afraid that every car should be a clean car, and then no one would have paid tax. So they withdraw that exemption. But what you should do is to give a differentiated price between cars depending on the fuel. If you have electrical cars, if you have, and there is coming now, and lorry and light lorries and trucks, and hybrids and that, and biogas cars, I think it would be a very strong driver, and it will really change the situation for competition.
So my somewhat flippant question is there anything that the Swedes don't do right? Does anybody want to answer that question? David, you want to answer that question?
Yeah.
And anything the Swedes don't do right?
Thing that the Swedes do poorly. Hockey? No.
I don't know. They're not known for their cuisine globally, but getting back to the question on freight, I mean, there's a couple of other opportunities. One is that if you're reducing congestion, then trucks are idling less on our streets, and so there's a lot less pollution due to that. And trucks have a higher value of time, so generally they'll pay the toll, whereas cars might be more likely to be priced off, and so this will make freight traffic run a little bit smoother. And second, if you have parking charges, then you're less likely to have trucks circling the block for looking for parking or double parking on streets, which creates a lot of other problems. So if you can manage it right and consider your high value of time vehicles, there's a lot you can do. You can also move trucks into the off-peak, and particularly overnight, if your receivers are willing to take shipments in the middle of the night, and that's, of course, has to be negotiated with the shipments. New York has a pilot program to subsidize receivers who are willing to take goods in the middle of the night, and apparently that's been fairly successful.
So this is one of the things that I've encountered in talking to people about congestion pricing, and it comes back to the public acceptability point, that I think there's a lot of people who they think that the only problem with congestion is that they are white-knuckling it on the roads and they're wasting time. But one of the reasons we wrote this report is to talk about all of the other costs as well, and you've just talked about them, the environmental costs and the health costs and the higher price of goods that are sitting in trucks, backed up on highways. The plumber who doesn't get across town 5 times and only can do 3 jobs in a day, when with less congestion he could do 5 jobs in a day. I mean, these are all, I think most people don't think about these costs. And I think that's part of the kind of communications challenge in all of this.
Yeah, everybody's an expert on their own commute, and they know more about their commute than anybody else does, but very few people are looking at the whole system, and that's what pricing is. Basically, it's a compact between all the users to get everybody else to behave in a way that's useful for society as a whole. And there are gains to be had by getting people to coordinate a little bit more, and prices are a really good mechanism for enabling that coordination.
Okay, folks, we are in the last few minutes, so I'm going to ask each of you to give me a very snappy 24-second pitch. You can say anything you want. You can even just talk about Sweden if you want. But a 24-second pitch on what you want to say to everybody out there in Google Hangout land. Let's start with Eric.
Well, I would just say that understanding how immediately people change their opinions on congestion pricing once they see it in action is something you should take to heart. Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't work. So if you are truly interested in improving your own life and your own commute, you should really think about how it works in a larger scheme.
Nice pitch. Gunnar, you're next.
Well, if you want to do something to the traffic, nowadays the technology is so cheap that you can introduce a trial with congestion charges and you got almost all your money back after a year. So make a try, make an agreement with your citizen. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, we withdraw it. But let's try it.
Okay, thank you. David, you're next. 24 seconds.
Yeah, so we should be thinking about transportation, roads, and transit as public utilities. And when we have public utilities, we pay for their use proportionate to how much we use, and everybody understands that. And right now we've got transportation lumped in with all of the rest of government services, and so we sort of don't see the value that transportation provides and don't see that the user fees that we pay are directly going to provide the services that we're using.
Perfect, thank you. Lauren?
Great. So as a practitioner, I would say it's not enough to be a policy wonk and know why we have to do these things. It's important. How we do it is important. Relying on a pilot project, being really concrete about what you're actually going to deliver every citizen and focusing that benefit on drivers, because that's usually the majority mode in most cities in North America. Packaging whatever policy changes you want to make with excellent communications. And I would say also the future of some of these ideas really relies on government upping their IT game, their technology game. If we're going to use new tools, we have to build trust by demonstrating our ability to deliver over and over again on projects like this.
Thank you. Okay, Sam, you get the last word. The last 24 seconds goes to you.
Okay, in a city, perhaps our most precious resource is space. What do we do with precious resources? We price it appropriately. So in this case, we would price the amount of space that a car would use, and that's called congestion pricing. And the parking industry has been practicing congestion pricing for years, and they've been one of the biggest obstacles. So how about the government gets into the congestion pricing business too?
All right, thank you all very much. So just to summarize those, I'm going to do all of your 24 seconds in my single 24 seconds. So Eric says, evidence proves this works, so just look around. Gunnar says, technology is cheap, so let's do it. David says, we got to think about this like electricity and other utilities, like user charges. Lauren says, details matter and explanation is really important. And Sam says, he didn't say space is the final frontier. He said space is the most precious resource, but it might be this final frontier too. So that's wonderful. Thank you all very much. That is all the time we have today to do this. So if you out there are interested in this issue, I encourage you to go to www.ecofiscal.ca. That's the Ecofiscal Commission's website. Check out our new report. It's got lots of examples from a bunch of cities that we talked about today. It talks about how we can use those in Canada. It even sketches out kind of just a sketch of proposals for 4 cities. And it really, I encourage you to like curl up on a couch with a cup of coffee or any hot drink and cuddle up with that with the report. It is long. There it is again. It's 40-something pages, but it is just an absolute piece of beauty. I want to thank all of the experts that we've got today, Lauren, Sam, Eric, Gunnar, and David. Please keep an eye out for the work that these guys are doing because their work is really important. It is changing the way we move around our cities for the better. We will post a video of this hangout on our website and encourage you all to tell us what you think about it, whether you liked doing this or whether you didn't like it or whether it worked or not. And anyway, that's the end. So thank you all very much. All the best to all of you. Travel safely, travel often, and get home to see your kids sooner. It's the family reunification fee or something like that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
And now we've got to hang